Much, Mr. Chair. And I would yield myself 5 minutes at this point.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this bill provides for $268 billion in defense spending for fiscal year 98, $2.6 billion more than was requested by President Clinton. My amendment provides for an across-the-board 5% cut in overall defense spending. As authorized by this bill, it will cut $13.4 billion. Mr. Speaker, this amendment is about national priorities and is the only amendment that has been allowed on the floor which calls for a cut in military spending. The bottom line that we are discussing here is pretty simple. At a time when the Cold War is over, when the Soviet Union no longer exists, when we are militarily outspending all of our so-called enemies by huge amounts, we do not need to continue spending this kind of money for the military. We do not need to fund the military at almost the same level it was at the heart of the Cold War. Mr. Speaker, when we talk about U.S. military spending, we must also put it in the context of the current world situation. While we are now spending $264 billion, our NATO allies are also spending over $200 billion. Combined, we and our allies are spending close to $500 billion on the military. And how much are our so-called enemies spending? Cuba, $300 million. Libya, $1.4 billion. Syria, $1.8 billion. North Korea, $2.4 billion. Iraq, $2.7 billion. Iran, $3.4 billion. China, well, I don't know that China is an enemy. I gather they're going to get MFN status. They're spending $32 billion. I don't believe that Russia is also our enemy, being that we're heavily funding them, but they're spending $82 billion, just to mention. What all of this means is that the United States alone is spending many times more than all of our so-called enemies combined, and if you add NATO into the equation, the numbers become absurd. Cuba, Libya, Syria, North Korea, Iraq, and Iran combined spend $12 billion a year on the military, while we are proposing in this budget $268 billion, more than 20 times the combined spending of all of these so-called enemies. Further, this budget does not include the tens of billions we spend on the intelligence budget. Mr. Speaker, the question that all of us must ask is, when is enough enough? Yes, all of us want the United States to have the strongest military in the world. But when we spend so much on defense, we are adding to our very large national debt and are terribly ignoring the pressing domestic needs that tens and tens of millions of Americans are facing, needs which are getting worse. Let us get our priorities straight. Mr. Speaker, when we spend this much money on the military, we have to cut Medicare by $115 billion. That's wrong. When we spend this much money on the military, we are asked to cut veterans' benefits, veterans' health care, over the next 5 years by $5 billion. So we're spending money on B-2 bombers and Star Wars, and we say thank you to the men and women who served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. We don't care about you. We're worried about B-2 bombers and Star Wars. That's wrong. When we spend this much money on the military, we're cutting back $13 billion on Medicaid for hospitals that serve the poorest people in America. Yeah, let's spend $100 billion defending Europe, but if you're poor and you need to go into the hospital, Uncle Sam is not there for you. And when we spend this much money on the military, drastic cutbacks take place in housing and in other important needs. There are some people on this Congress who are proposing cuts in Social Security. Yeah, more money for B-2 bombers, cutbacks in Social Security. Millions of American families, thousands in the state of Vermont, can't afford to send their kids to college. We spend $30 billion for higher education, and we're proposing $268 billion for the military. In my view, those priorities are absolutely wrong. Mr. Speaker, this is a great nation, but our priorities are wrong. People on the other side and on this side talk about balancing the budget. Well, you know what? Military spending has something to do with a deficit, too. So I hope that our deficit hawks, who talk about the $5 trillion debt, will come on board and say, no, if we're serious about moving toward a balanced budget, we've got to cut military spending. Mr. Speaker, bottom line is priorities. We're spending too much. Let's cut military spending by 5% and still retain, by far, the strongest military on earth.
Gentleman's time has expired.